This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Before you do anything else, please subscribe to my new YouTube channel at youtube.com/the@ and then the Reason Interview. That's youtube.com/the Reason Interview. My guest today is John Arnold, the former Enron wunderkind turned billionaire philanthropist who's determined to hack America's most expensive and least accountable public sector systems in areas like criminal justice, education, and pensions. Fun fact, he was once called the most hated man in pensionland by Governing Magazine due to his reform efforts. We talk about why those public pensions are so out of control and how to fix them, how Medicare squeezes billions of unnecessary dollars out of taxpayers, and how Enron scammed its investors not despite regulations, but in full view of them. And we discuss why, despite all our problems, he's still betting on America to get better, not worse. Here is the Reason Interview with John Arnold. John Arnold, thanks for talking to Reason.
Great to be here.
So you and your wife, Laura, head up Arnold Ventures, which is a gigantic philanthropy. I want to get into that. And I also want to start, though, by asking you, you signed on to the Giving Pledge. Explain what the Giving Pledge is and why you said, yeah, this is us.
So the Giving Pledge is a non-binding pledge that somebody signs that says we're going to give away at least half of our assets to the philanthropic sector at some point.
Yeah. And it started in the early 2010s, right? Thereabouts?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think we were always inclined that way. I think we have the benefit of getting to see 100 plus years of very significant wealth in this country.
Yeah.
And the good things it can do and also the bad things it can do. And I think one of the learnings of seeing different families deal with the wealth, especially second generation and third generation, is that at times it brings families together and at times it divides.
Right. I mean, they're Canadian, but this is the MacArthur Foundation, right? Where the older generation of the MacArthur money, it was a guy who is conservative. His son, who publishes Harper's, is very liberal. So there's that.
Right.
But can I ask, it's a truism within kind of libertarian circles that, people like Henry Ford or Bill Gates have done much more for society by building the products that made them billionaires rather than the philanthropy they do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the private sector solves most problems.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the default. If a problem exists, the private sector should try to do it.
Yeah.
Now, at times, it's not incentivized to do it, or there are bad incentives. And so then the government is kind of round two.
Yeah.
So you think about like public goods,
right?
The private sector is not going to fund those in the right way. And so that there's a role for government to come in and do the things that private sector is not. And then I think philanthropy is third. In some ways, it's maybe the least effective of the three, even though all the inefficiencies associated with government. That philanthropy is looking for things where the private sector and the public sector either don't have the incentive or the will to try to address those issues.
And I mean, part of it is just a knowledge problem, right? Where nobody's thinking about these problems, and maybe the private sector isn't incentivized to do research on them, and the public sector isn't either.
Exactly. Or, the public sector might not be incentivized. The public sector is driven by politicians, right? And so you got to think about what are the incentives for politicians. And one of those is you want to talk about things that work. And if you fund something as a politician, if you champion something and it doesn't work, your political opponent in the next race is going to use it against you. Look at all this money you lost.
Do you, there's a truism, particularly I think this is on the kind of right side of the political spectrum, to say, well, you know what? Philanthropy worked, charity worked, and then the government, particularly in the progressive era in the early 20th century, started usurping, various kinds of functions that, groups often based on ethnicity or something else, some other affinity, got pushed out of the market. Does that ring true to you?
I think you take 100 years ago, 200 years ago, things were much more built around the family.
Right.
Families were bigger, families stayed together, you stayed on the same piece of land often. And so one generation took care of the next.
Yeah.
Right? Or whenever one generation got too old, then you had the kids taking care of the parents. And that's not how we live today.
Right.
And so kind of over time, as people have become more nomadic across the US, and I think there's a lot of benefit to that, and
Right.
that's how people want to live, at least today, then it's kind of changed what the family dynamic is. And so sometimes the kids can't take care of the parents or vice versa. Or you're away from your family. And so I think the role of government's probably changed just as family dynamic has changed.
How you are famously a Houstonian. How are you one of these people who say, I am like a 10th generation Texan, or like how long have you been planted in Houston as a
So I was born and raised in Texas, born in Dallas. My brother was born in
Dallas is practically Canada though, right? If you're in Houston.
My brother was born in Pennsylvania, so the parents moved between my brother and me.
Yeah.
Came down for opportunity. Right? Came down for a job. I think that's why a lot of people move to Texas.
Yeah, and certainly why they're moving here now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk. Your areas of interest are kind of interesting. I mean, you fund a lot of K through 12 education stuff, and you were big on the KIPP schools, Knowledge is Power program, right?
Exactly.
That's what it's an acronym for. You do criminal justice, you do pension reform, and you fund some of Reason Foundation's work on that. And then also things like open science or in the integrity of science. How do you pick what your foundation funds?
Yeah, we're involved in about a dozen different areas. You're going to add on housing and infrastructure policy and healthcare costs. I think the tie amongst them is that experience in the K-12 reform movement, which I've been part of for over 25 years now, was kind of a learning that top-down implementation of programs is very difficult and just doesn't work, especially for a bottoms-up type of field like K-12 is. So much of school success is about the teacher and the principal that are in the building. And so the question is, if you're the bureaucrat from above, right, trying to push down this new curriculum, trying to say like the school should do X, Y, Z. Even when the research shows that they're successful, it's just very hard for that stuff to scale and be successful. And so we very much over time, got a theory of change in K-12 just about policy rather than programs and about the rules and incentives of systems.
So talk a little bit about that. Is it that and one of the stats I remember, this was decades ago, I did some education stuff, and one of the most amazing facts, that I came across, and maybe it's not that interesting, but in 1930, there were something like 130,000 school districts in America. Basically, every town was its own school district. There are now fewer than 13,000. So there's been, the population has exploded compared to, 100 years ago, and the number of school districts has decline. I mean, there's just so much more centralization. But what you're saying is that in education, you find the real change happens kind of dispersed throughout the system.
Right. So we're thinking about it from the system standpoint about, I guess, with the first principle that government shouldn't be both the service provider and the regulator. Right. You can't regulate yourself. There has to be an accountability mechanism coming from somewhere else. Now, technically, the state regulates the school district. In reality, the state is very, very reluctant to step in. The politics involved in that are very difficult on both sides. And so, historically, you've had the school district just be accountable to itself. And it may be an elected school board, and there's all types of problems, I think, with single district elected school boards. And so the question is, what's the right role of government? And we think that government should be a strong regulator of nonprofit service providers, i.e. charter schools. And so this kind of goes back to my first entry was with KIPP and this charter school that was getting very different results from the school down the street that was educating a same demographic.
What is, in the end, is there a secret sauce to education other than involvement by all of the stakeholders, particularly parents, but also teachers, et cetera?
God, I wish there was. I think K-12 is the field that's just been hardest to crack. And it's not just in the US. There's no urban school system that looks at it and say, oh, they've nailed it.
And they're the ones that have to. I mean, the first city that comes up with a better than average school system, however you define that, would be like the greatest city in the world.
Right.
Everybody would want to live there.
Right. It's ironic is that this problem vexes the world as well, right? And so, kind of famously, Wendy Kopp, who started Teach for America, she ended up starting Teach for All because she was getting so many requests from people in other countries saying, we're struggling with our schools, help us. And so she started Teach for All, and she works in dozens of countries now. But kind of every country, especially for the low income and at-risk populations, really struggles with education.
Pension reform. You, in 2017, Governing Magazine referred to you in a genuinely flattering article as the most hated man in pensionland. What is your interest in pension reform, and what's, if charter schools are kind of the big picture takeaway for education, K through 12 education, what's the big reform in pensions?
Yeah, well, I will fact check that as true statement. That certainly there was a time when we were the most hated people. I think 49 out of 50 states have a balanced budget amendment. And the purpose of that is to say that the current generation should be paying for the services that the current generation is getting. Right? It shouldn't be punting the cost to the next generation. And more or less that balanced budget amendment works with one big exception. And that exception has gotten so big you can drive a truck through it, and that's public pensions. And so what's happened is that oftentimes you have a public union contract that comes up, and politicians have to make a choice. They say, like, either we give them more money for their kind of annual raises, which means we either have to cut services or raise taxes, or we can punt this. We can offer them, instead of raising their salaries, we can give them more benefits. And that's kind of the secret way to hide the cost, and we don't have to make this hard trade-off.
Why do state employees buy into that, though? Because this is, a lot of the times, I mean, it kind of happens, but often, like, why wouldn't they be like, no, we'll take 50% of what you say you'll pay us in the future. We'll take that now.
And the irony is that, when you do studies and look at how much would you trade off in pension benefits for current income, the state should be paying more in current income because that's what most employees actually value.
And it would be less money over the long haul.
Over the long haul, but that's not where the political incentives are, of course. But I think the reason is that it's become a reason as to why people will join is that they understand that they get less money today with a very, very generous benefit in the future.
And I guess there was a long period of time, particularly right after World War II, where the fringe benefits or whatever, the compensation package might have been more. If you got job security and like a Cadillac retirement plan and healthcare plan, that made sense. So we're still kind of locked in that. What's the best way out of this trap?
So I think there's three components. One is get rid of the abuses. So there are some loopholes in this system, like you could not take a vacation for the final 10 years of your career and use all that, cash it all out the last year.
Like the last year or two, you buy other people's overtime, and suddenly your salary might have been $70,000, but you make $200,000 your last year, and that's what you're paying.
And then you get 70% of $200,000 until you die. Right?
Or until you're killed.
And so, those what I call kind of loopholes or abuses. That wasn't how the intent of the system, right? So that's a component of it. I think it's a relatively small component.
And that's kind of been locked down, right? I mean, most of that's been
taken care of. That was really, reading about some of those abuses caught my eye and got me very interested. And then as you start to research, you understand that it's the funding design and benefit design that are driving the main problems. Right, and the funding design is how much is the city or state putting away today in order to meet that benefit tomorrow. And you can play lots of games there. Either you can just blatantly underfund it based upon the actuarial tables, or you can make these very aggressive assumptions. And so, there's kind of famously that, the more you assume that your investments will make over the years, the less money you have to put aside today. And so,
and you have states like California, Illinois, et cetera, have really done they've exploited that, right? Where they're like, you're going to be making, 10% average return on these investments that we're not even making, so we don't have to fund as much right now.
Exactly. And everybody's kind of in on the game. And what was curious to me is I started digging in and started talking to unions and started talking to, some of the representatives is like they recognize these return assumptions are too high, but they don't want them changed. They don't want them lowered.
Yeah.
They should, because that would force the state or city to put more money in today to make it, ensure or raise the probability that payout exists in the future.
Right.
They are convinced that whatever the city or state is supposed to pay, they will end up paying. They'll find a way.
Yeah.
And they are worried that if you lower the return percentage assumption, that draw on money today will put more kind of force the issue and encourage reform that they don't want to see.
So then, is the big answer a shift to defined contribution rather than defined benefit plan for pensions?
If you look at private sector, people have a hybrid, right?
Yeah.
You have Social Security and you have a 401k or IRA, right? And so there's this component of it that you don't want to let people kind of risk everything in a private investment portfolio and end up 65 years old with nothing.
Right.
And so that's what Social Security allows, is kind of a guaranteed stream that's there for as long as you live.
Right.
And that's important. And so we think that something that looks like a hybrid system is right for kind of 90% of Americans. Why not the 100% of Americans?
And that seems to be gaining ground. I mean, in the way that school choice has certainly been exploding over the past couple of years after a lot of buildup, but it seems like more states, more localities are okay with the idea of creating defined contribution plans for public sector employees.
Yeah, certainly for new employees. Yeah. I think there's a principle of don't change the benefits that have already been earned.
Right.
I think there are some other ways, some other reforms you can do in order to make sure that the risk is shared between the state and the employee. And so,
what are some of those?
So, like one is that your cost of living adjustment is lower if the fund is underfunded by a certain amount.
Right.
Right. So if the investment returns are not meeting the assumption that both the employee and the state, share some of that risk rather than it being 100% on the state.
Talk about your interests in healthcare. What's the main focus of of Arnold Ventures' interest in healthcare policy?
Yeah. So we looked at it, and as we, kind of decided one day, we looked at what are the topics that interest us, including, public finance and education and criminal justice. That, the tie amongst those was this policy component and these large systems and market failures associated with it. And so here's this huge healthcare system. It's just obvious that we need to start thinking about that. And so one of the draws was, that there were a number of abuses or inefficiencies that experts had identified. But it was one that special interests were very powerful in. And so that's why.
What is the main one of those?
So there's many. So there's a big question about how do you price pharmaceuticals that are necessary to kind of quality of life, but have a regulated monopoly, right? And that are paid for by the government, right? Like, what's the pricing of that? There's kind of questions about, so in Medicare Advantage, you see insurance companies have figured out loopholes that if we upcode our patient population, that is, we make them look less healthy than they are, then we get higher reimbursements. So they tell their doctors, you need to spend time and go make sure, ask every question about their health. Even if this doesn't bother the patient at all, they would never have mentioned it to the doctor because it doesn't affect their quality of health, whatever. If the insurance company can check it on their records, they get a higher reimbursement, right? And so you kind of live in a world where every patient is below average health. Right. Or things like site neutral policy. So hospitals get higher reimbursements from Medicare than a doctor's office that's in the suburbs does. And so what happens, the hospitals figure this out. They buy the doctor's office. It's the same doctor in the same location doing the same service.
But now he's a hospital.
But because the sign on the front door changed, the rates go up 50%.
Are you, there's been talk about DOGE, more generally, but turning to Medicare and Medicaid fraud. And I know Obama's chief economic advisor for a while was Christina Romer, a highly respected economist, who at one point had published a study where nearly 30% of Medicare, she said 30% of its expenditures could have been cut without any effect on patient income. So there's a lot of, I don't know if it's waste, fraud, or abuse, but there's a lot of looseness in that system. Do you think DOGE or somebody, like, how do you cut Medicare expenditures without having, every senior citizen in their personalized rascal scooter marching or driving on DC?
Right. And the fundamental principle is we don't want to touch access to care.
Right.
That's not the right way to try to lower costs in the healthcare system. Right. It is going after this proverbial waste, fraud, and abuse. And there's a lot of this stuff has been identified. We've identified some of it. Many other people have identified most of it. Right? It's always been more of a political problem. And again, the healthcare lobby is the most powerful of any in the United States. It is just amazing how many dollars and how many bodies they have in DC to try to make sure that the system doesn't change.
How do you cut that?
Yeah, so it almost needs a forcing mechanism. Right, and you find that whenever Congress wants to introduce something new, and also feels compelled to pay for it. So in the IRA, Democrats put in pharmaceutical pricing provisions in it to save money, and now with the TCJA extension, that's probably going to cost $4.5 trillion or so. And at least in the House reconciliation instructions, they've mandated at least $2 trillion of savings. And so now you have this forcing function that necessitates finding money, finding savings. And without that, Congress wouldn't act. They know this stuff. The people on the committee, they know it. But this is just part of the political process that until they need to pay for something that they want even more and are willing to infuriate all those lobbyists, then it doesn't happen. And so we have this very interesting window that's going to happen sometime this year, right, where it actually is, okay, we need to find hundreds of billions of dollars of savings in the healthcare system. And there's more and more consensus that Congress doesn't want that to come from access. And so then you have to go into the waste, fraud, and abuse.
Criminal justice, you're in Texas. Texas, I don't know if it's still the kind of prison capital of America, but it was a big thing. What's your interest in criminal justice, and what are the best ways to kind of make the criminal justice system more? I was going to say less punitive. I don't actually. I mean to be more efficient.
To be better,
I guess. Yeah.
I kind of joked that we were government efficiency before government efficiency was cool. Right? We didn't have a catchy name for it. We call it evidence-based policy and program integrity. And it's like just thinking about the criminal justice system and the goals of it and the stakeholders. And so you can think about the goals. Obviously, public safety is goal number one, right? You can never lose that. But there's also the rights of the accused and convicted, the financial cost of the system, the collateral damage to neighborhoods and to families, and you can think of more. And so the question is, how do you balance those? And especially, how can you improve some of the other goals while maintaining or improving public safety, right? And so that's kind of our fundamental view of the field. And we think, there's been a lot of things. And I think the field has gone from the crime bill under Clinton, which when crime was climbing, kind of the steady trend, and a very rational response by Congress that was just facing the wrath of crime in the neighborhoods, and you had Black communities were calling for it, and actually leading a lot of that effort, right, because of the damage that criminal activity was having in these neighborhoods. But we're in a very different world right now, right? And kind of the amount of crime is going down. It's been on this steady trend down. And we've seen the effect of that tough on crime mantra in a number of areas. And even Texas saw this. So Texas very much had a tough on crime mantra in the up until about 2007, when there's this big kind of famous prison bill that came up that says we need to build 7 new prisons. And they stepped back and looked at the financial cost of that and said, like, okay, we got to either raise taxes or cut spending in education, or like, what if we just do things smarter? Right. And so it went from tough on crime to smart on crime.
Right.
And I think that was the realization that a conservative state is looking at this saying we can maintain or even improve public safety while we run the system better.
So a lot of it is like forcing government to say, okay, this has a bill that you have to pay kind of in the here and now, and then people suddenly become much more creative, right, in how they deliver education or healthcare or safety, public safety.
Right. So I think there's components of it. The criminal justice system is just so complex, from the police, the DAs, public defenders, the judges, the jails and prisons, reentry system, including parole and probation, and we kind of work on all of that.
Yeah.
And there's no magic bullet in this, the silver bullet in this. It is, this is constant. How do you make the system slowly better over time?
One of the you do a lot of work on gun violence as well, and this, for a libertarian audience, I think people will be surprised by some of the findings that you found, the correlation between gun ownership and gun violence. What has Arnold Ventures broadly kind of found through its research on guns?
Yeah, like many issues, we kind of get pulled into things, and so we often find that policymakers are struggling with an issue, and they come and say, well, what's going on in this field? And so obviously there's been a lot of concern about mass shootings and about homicides in general, and the role of guns in those. And so the question to us was, what does the evidence show? And we very much view that as part of our role in public policy, is like
generating data.
Yeah, both generating research as well as translating the research to policymakers. And so we ended up funding a lot of research on guns, as well as trying to translate that to policymakers. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of good answers, right? And so I think that one of the learnings from it is that there's a limited number of interventions, but if you look at the things that are both constitutional, as well as understand and appreciate the hundreds of millions of guns that are on the street today, as well as that are effective. Right. It's a very small
and in a very broad sense, going back to say like the mid 90s, there are many more guns in circulation, and it's legal to own or carry guns. Gun crime is generally down, but then if I'm recalling correctly, some of the research I did, I think was through a RAND study that you guys funded, finding that, for women particularly, having a gun in the house raised there was a strong 10 or 12% higher than average correlation with suicide. Things like that. So part of it is just figuring out what is actually happening.
I think we've seen states institute red flag laws, saying that for people who are not mentally stable for a certain time period, that the state can remove their guns. It's controversial. It's controversial in conservative states. There's an effort, in Texas right now, to revoke some of those, or to not recognize other states' red flag laws. And so there's, it's a tough area. Unfortunately, not everything has a great answer to it, and sometimes we just say, we don't have a great solution.
How do you define yourself, kind of politically or ideologically? Because you fund, market-based groups, libertarian groups. Your background is in trading. I want to talk a little bit about that. You're, but many of your policy goals seem to be fully in line with a kind of progressive mentality. Do you think of yourself as particularly this or that when it comes to ideology or politics?
I think I would disagree that our answers are more progressive.
I wasn't taking answers. I mean, like the goals.
Look, actually, I think I disagree with that. I think what we find is, policymakers want solutions, right? Especially local and state policymakers who don't have the ability just to spend more money at problems. They want to know what to do. And especially if you can come and say, here's what the evidence is as to how you can improve outcomes for any system without spending more money. We find that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that there's a lot of interest there.
Yeah.
And we work with people on the far left, we work with people on the far right. It tends to be just very much issue specific.
Right.
So we often get asked in, right? And so we're not going to show up in some community and say, you should do X. It's a community that's struggling with a problem and kind of ask us for help, and we try to provide that.
And that, I think it, among what I find most interesting in a lot of ways about what you guys are doing is this commitment to like either open science or science with integrity or research with integrity. That seems fascinating. Like that's kind of what you're focusing on, is like getting actual data and then you making sure that this stuff is real, as opposed to, you're doing research that just happens to find what you wanted to find.
Right.
Well, how did you get interested in that?
Let me just add one thing to the previous question, because I think a lot of one of the criteria that we have on when to enter a new area is, when do we think this bipartisan window is going to open?
Right.
And we think, we're very hesitant to work in partisan issues. There's a lot of groups that are interested in on the partisan side. There's a lot of funding and think tanks that are interested in partisan issues. And there's kind of a dearth that are looking at where's the policy window open, kind of the intersection of left and right. And part of that is that the will to try to address an issue comes. And then we try to help on, okay, where are the bipartisan solutions? Because we think if they are bipartisan, that they'll be more sustainable, right? And the next administration doesn't throw it out and do their own things. I think so. The question on like what got us interested in evidence base, some of that was my background in trading and thinking about that there had to be, you're always questioning, what, are you right? Are your assumptions on a problem right? And every day you go in and like, here's my view. What's the counter side? What's the counter argument for that? And then I think, trying to, enter this field of philanthropy, which is enormously complicated, without, especially at the time, without great data, and try to figure out, okay, what's the highest value add we can have in the field? And that was involved trying to read a lot of research and a lot of studies. And sometimes we learned stuff from that, and sometimes we ended up more confused than when we started after that. And so we realized that there was both a dearth of supply and demand of evidence in policy making. And so we wanted to attack both problems, and we wanted to go fund a lot new of high quality research on kind of social policy and social programs, try to figure out what works and what doesn't. And then second, you can do all the supply, you can fund, but if nobody's taking it up, if nobody's using it, then it doesn't do any good. So there has to be kind of the corresponding, how do you increase demand for it? And so like this week we were in Oklahoma with Governor Stitt announcing this new program to bring kind of new funding for proven programs that have that meet the highest bar of success from the research into Oklahoma. And it's 10 million of our money, 10 million of state money, which in the grand scheme of things is not that much money, but it's an attempt to change the culture of how state legislatures start allocating.
What's one of the issues that you're like, okay, we're going to look at here's where the good research clearly points, these are better programs or policies than whatever else was being considered?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of trends has been this push for college for all, right? And trying to put as many people into college. And then with the benefit of, hindsight now, we get to see what this 20 plus years of college for all, what the results are. And I think society is looking back and saying, scratching their heads and saying, there are a lot of people who enrolled who did not get certificates or degrees that the market valued. Right. The purpose of going.
Although there is still a premium, right, to having a college degree.
Well,
generally,
I think on average, right, those with college degrees, do much better financially than those without college degrees. But a lot of that is selection bias, right? And so if you think about the marginal kid, is it right? The right path to go to college, to go to a 4-year college, 2-year college, a certificate program, an apprenticeship program, et cetera. And I think one thing that's been missing there has been good data and good transparency on outcomes. And so that's really, a field that we've been trying to push on is like, whenever a kid's making that decision, he's 18 years old and trying to decide, like, what am I going to do for the next 4 years? At least have good data about, kids that look like me or have the same background, academic background that I do, and they go to this school and major in this thing or get this degree. Like, how effective is that?
And then I guess going backwards, that also, I mean, clearly, K through 12 curricula, particularly in high school, has changed so that in many parts of the country, things like vocational and technical education has just kind of disappeared, partly because if everybody's going to college, then you're not going to have as many shop classes, et cetera. And if you find out that, well, you know what, like a lot of people would flourish, doing a trade, you could start doing that in high school.
Right. And I think there was, been this longstanding concern about tracking kids.
Right.
And today we track them at age 18.
Right.
Right. And the question is 18 the right age? And if we think, kids in high school should not necessarily be tracked, but they can be introduced to programs, right? You can have more options open.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's been this very broad and bipartisan interest in kind of reintroducing CTE back into high school. And again, just to show, like, if you're like to work with your hands, here are some careers that are in high demand, pay high wages, that are open to you. And here's an introduction to them. You're still on the path to go to a 4-year school if that's what you choose, or a 2-year school. Right. But here's also a career path.
It's kind of exciting, right? We seem to be at a point where a lot of stuff that's been around for, say 50 or really 100 years, things like occupational licensing, zoning, or the kind of post-war education system, a lot of it's coming up for review, right? Which is good, because we live in a different world.
Agree.
Can I ask, this is might be a strange question to you, but what is it like, what's it feel like being a billionaire? Because there's not that many of you.
That process of going from not a billionaire to very wealthy, right, was kind of shocking. Yeah. Right? It kind of is a shock to the system. And I think it started to change my personality a little bit. And then my family kind of slaps me up. Right. And like, get back to it. And like, okay. And then like, now it's, my vacations are better than, if I weren't a billionaire. Right. But much of my life is kind of the same. Yeah. Right. And it's like, you get happiness from, success in your family. You get happiness by, spending time with friends. By having high quality moments. Yeah. I probably work more hours today than I've ever worked in my life, right? And so,
and you launched into kind of your career, or maybe not launched into your career, but you worked at Enron.
I did,
and I mean, when Enron collapsed, you were not touched by any kind of scandal or anything like that. But what is it like to if you Google, if somebody Googles you, one of the first things they'll learn is that. I think in 2001 or 2002, or so, right before Enron went into bankruptcy, you were given I think it was an $8 million bonus, and you had made them, like hundreds of millions of dollars. Right. So in a way, it's like, why only 8? But what is it like to have kind of made your bones at the company that more than any other company in our lifetime is the poster child for just kind of bullshit, fake capitalism?
Yeah, it was, I started at Enron directly out of school when I was 21 years old. And it was a fantastic place to work because it was growing so quickly. Right. It was really pioneering a new industry. Everybody wanted to be Enron. Yeah. All the other historic natural gas pipeline companies were hiring Enron people away to go, copy the Enron business model, which then allowed a young person that could prove that they could handle responsibility and was motivated to move up much faster at Enron than in a different type of field. And so I was a huge beneficiary of that. My timing was kind of exactly right. And by the time I was 26 years old, I was the head trader at Enron. And Enron was the largest firm in the industry. Yeah. And so just an enormous amount of benefit from being there at a young age.
So what was the at root, what was the scam in Enron?
Yeah.
And is it, answer that.
Yeah, I think it was hubris.
Yeah.
Right? It was a company where the culture was, we can't do wrong. And so what started to happen was, Enron had a great thing, kind of discovered this new industry. It actually was kind of originated out of the deregulation of natural gas that happened in the 80s. And the energy system in America used to be very highly regulated. It used to be kind of, the government would set the price of natural gas, and then you get these booms and busts, and it was clear that was a bad system. Jimmy Carter started the deregulation in the late 70s, and then Reagan, and then finally with Bush. And then, so what happened was, the system used to be integrated, where you had the producer and the pipeline and the end user would kind of be the same. It was recognition that the natural monopoly of those three was the pipeline. And so let's separate that out and highly regulate that. But the producers, that's kind of a naturally highly competitive market, and end users, that's a highly competitive market. So it created the need for someone to do the logistics of moving gas around. And that was really what Enron, kind of as it emerged from just a natural gas pipeline and production company, it started being a logistics company. And it was serving a huge need for the market that still exists through today. And earned a lot of money from it. And it started trying to apply that logistics framework to other industries. The power industry, it was deregulating during this time as well. And there was, parts of the water industry were deregulating, and the growth of broadband, and people thought you could trade broadband and trucking and all these things. And this was the rise of using the internet for disintermediation. Right. And so there was kind of a lot of value creation to be done. And Enron was, started having these very consistent and high growth earnings. And because of that, it got rewarded by the market by having a high PE valuation, much higher than its peers. And then you almost get trapped by that, where if you're being rewarded because you're growing faster and more consistently than the market, the problem is that if you ever miss that, you lose that huge premium. And it's not your stock goes down 5%, but you lose 50%. And I think, kind of looking back, it was very similar to what happened with GE. Like the two companies were kind of almost identical in their hubris and how they traded relative to their peer companies. And you saw GE, which came days from going bankrupt, was only saved because it was deemed a strategic financial institution in 2008. And it took 10 years for them to work out, and Enron did go bankrupt, of course.
One of the things that's interesting is Enron, almost a year before it, the scandal kind of publicly hit and it kind of was vaporized, the market started, turning against it. So in a way, I mean, Enron is held up as this, this is what capitalism brings, these fake companies that create bubbles and then, destroy the lives of people. That's one way of looking at it. Is part of it also that the markets kind of, over time, they figure out who's scamming and who's not?
Yeah, and I think the regulation changed after Enron, right? And I think, people complain about it, but one of the, great things about the U.S. capital market system is that investors put a higher level of trust into American companies than they do overseas companies. Partially because of these regs, and we can have the debates about, the cost benefit and is it a little bit too much, is it not enough, right? But I think some of that regulatory framework is valuable. Right? And because of that, again, American companies trade at higher multiples because of the confidence from investors, and they're held to higher standards. And I think capital markets over time figure these things out. Now, the frauds, unfortunately, you can't get rid of them entirely. And whenever it happens, there's always going to be a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot of pain from the employees, there's going to be a lot of pain from investors, and in the communities in which these firms operate. But I think, we've gotten better as a society, as a kind of as a financial industry of minimizing those over time.
How, you say, okay, sometimes the regulations go overboard, sometimes they're not enough. Coming out of the, I guess Enron, but the tech bubble more generally, there were things like Sarbanes-Oxley, which supposedly chased a lot of companies over to Europe in order, they would list there rather than the US because of some of the clauses that were put into financial regulation, something like Dodd-Frank coming out of the financial crisis. How, is there a way to get regulation kind of right from the beginning as opposed to, kind of reacting and then kind of overreacting and then having a correction to that? Or
no, I don't think there is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is just learning by doing, right? And financial industry changes over time. People find ways to get around the regulation, and then you kind of have to adjust it, or wait for something to blow up and get the political will to adjust it. And so, I think this is the benefit of what happens at state policy versus federal policy, is that getting things right the first time is very difficult. And in state policy, they're willing to go back on an issue and kind of fix it, the next year, and adjust it again the next year. And you see this like with housing policies, that they'll pass something, and then the industry says, okay, you addressed these three things, but you forgot this fourth thing, right? Or this isn't working, and you go fix it. Whereas at the federal level, it feels like once every 20 years you get one bill on an issue,
whether that's
healthcare or financial industry, right?
And or immigration, not even, it's once every 50.
Exactly. Exactly. And you're stuck with the mistakes of it. Right. And then it becomes longer that those loopholes or kind of the bad regulatory regime lasts, the harder it is to fix it. And you almost need the whole thing to blow up somehow in order to get the political will to go do it again.
You have a very lively Twitter presence. And when I read your stuff on Twitter, I'm like, oh, this is optimistic in the sense that, you're engaging questions and, and they seem to be answerable, and that we can do policy better rather than worse. Do you feel like we're in a good age for public policy or for the possibilities of things? I mean, how do you feel about the next, couple of years, the next 10 years, the next 20 years?
Great question. First, I think you're the first person who's ever said my Twitter feed was optimistic.
Well, you should read mine sometimes. It's dank all the way down.
I think we've always tried to not just point out problems, but try to be constructive and say, okay, here's a problem and here's an idea about how to make the system better. Because it's easy to sit in the audience and just throw peanuts at the people who are coming up with policy, and actually coming up with better policy is hard, right? And so we've tried to keep that standard. But next 10, 20 years, it's always made sense to bet on America. Right? It's been such a robust country under so many different challenges. And so America faces some challenges today. It faced different challenges 10 years ago, faced different challenges in 10 years. And I want to bet on it because it's worked.
Yeah. Do you worry, in a kind of Trump 2.0 or Trump's second term, one of the things that I think he recognized in a way that, say Hillary Clinton didn't quite as explicitly, is that we were kind of post-hegemon, or, he recognized that people were feeling anxious about the current time and the future. And, he talked about that we could go back to a time when, a single, one male income earner could have an industrial job and, have, 50 children and buy steak every week and all of this kind of stuff. It's a false vision of the past, but he recognized there's a lot of anxiety and we're in a very economically uncertain time. Do you feel like when you say it's good to bet on America, it seems in a lot of ways people don't share that kind of optimism anymore? What do you think Trump is the solution going forward, or where do we go to regain our optimism more broadly, I guess?
Tough question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. I think, innovation's gotten harder over time. And there's been a lot written about this, about the difficulties in finding the next breakthrough, right? And so, how much of that rise in incomes, which is a rise in quality of life that happened in the 20th century, was picking the low-hanging fruit of innovations, because at the end of the day, a society can only consume what it produces over the long term, and so productivity and innovation are key to that. And if that's getting harder, then quality of life gains decrease just broadly, right? It doesn't matter who the president is, right, or which party's in charge. And I think this is where tech and there's all these great advancements or promises of next generation of technology have the real chance to greatly improve quality of life for people. And I think that's one potential outcome. You can imagine different outcomes from this tech. It might end up not meeting expectations, and kind of being marginal gains, but not transformative gains. And I think that's the big question is, especially you look at the U.S. financial situation and U.S. demographics. If you spend too much time looking at that, it's hard to walk away and say, I want to bet on America, right? Because we're facing a lot of headwinds. And then the question is, can technology and innovation make up for that?
Well, and I guess that's why I think you're optimistic, because you're not saying, AI or the next technology is going to destroy us all. You're like, it's probably going to, at least marginally improve lives. John Arnold, thanks so much for talking to Reason.
It's been great to be here.